Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor. You've obviously given us a lot to think about there and some great guidance for our discussion that we will get to. Although, as a diplomat, I might avoid some of the commentary on Brexit and President Trump and leave that to others to discuss. But you called for a greater intellectual presence from Australia, and now can I introduce someone that's playing a role in that? And turn to Professor Appleby to offer comments as well.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner Hilton, and thank you, Vice Chancellor Kumar, for your the initial remarks that you've made to this discussion. For those who were hoping to come and hear a debate today around this question of the role of education in creating a just society, I am sorry that I have to disappoint you because I will both have a similar focus to Raj in looking at the role of universities and higher education in creating a just society, but I also agree with many of the points that he was making in relation to the role of education. And so whilst you'll hear similar points being made in my presentation, I hope that I'm coming at it from a different perspective, the Australian perspective, and so I'll take you down a different path with a little bit of different scenery to then get the discussion rolling afterwards. So I agree that universities and higher educations are a critical part of every community reaching its hands out towards what Raj referred to as the objective or aspiration of a just society. And I speak these words as an educator in law schools across Australia now for more than 10 years. And so I want to talk about how I think universities contribute to the journey towards a just society, but I'm also going to speak about some of the challenges that lie in that path, just like Raj spoke about some of those challenges, demonstrating that this relationship between education and between universities and a just society is not necessarily inevitable and it's not necessarily linear. So throughout my paper, I'm going to talk a little bit about my university, UNSW, and more specifically my law school, the UNSW Law Faculty. The law faculty at UNSW Sydney takes very seriously our commitment to the pursuit of a more just society. For anyone who's visited the UNSW Sydney Law Faculty, and invite you all to do so if you haven't, what you'll notice is as you walk in, emblazoned proudly in our law school's foyer, is our motto, where law meets justice. And this was a statement that was made by our founding dean, Professor Hal Wotton, and we take this motto extremely seriously. So it's my view, which is very much informed by a humanities and law background, so again a similar perspective from that Raj had just brought, is that there are actually two key contributions that universities can make to creating a more just society. And the first contribution is through education. I'll speak predominantly to this. So this first contribution is about developing in their students who go on to become their country's civil society a questioning mind and the power of a questioning voice. I should say that this is certainly not discounting the importance of knowledge transmission at universities. I absolutely accept that there is a need for knowledge. Knowledge provides our students with the language and the grammar with which to enter their chosen profession, their chosen career. So it is a pivotal and a critical part of university education. But the first three steps of any educational journey, knowledge, comprehension and application, will not deliver graduates who contribute towards progressive social change. They do not deliver graduates who are encultured to look at how things have always been done and ask, how can this be done differently? How can this be done better? It is not until they're taught to question the knowledge that they are taught, to question the assumptions on which that knowledge is based, that university education starts to fulfil its potential to contribute to a just society. Thus, to reach that potential, universities must continue to focus on providing students with an education that teaches them, in addition to the discipline-specific knowledge, the tools of analysis, evaluation, and critical thought. At a personal level, I've been very heavily influenced in my thinking about the role of an educator and the role of universities by the work of Professor Stephen Brookfield and the work of Bell Hooks. So if any of you are familiar with this work, what I'm saying will be very familiar to you. They advocate for the teaching of critical thinking. So what is this idea of critical thought? It's not just a critique in their conception of it. It's about the art of analysing and challenging assumptions with a view to improving. And that's the critical last part. Brookfield talks about the process of questioning assumptions, identifying assumptions that exist in a particular discipline, whether it be law or medicine or engineering, to identify assumptions that exist within a particular community that have always done things a particular way, to question their basis, and whether they are producing the outcome that is captured within the assumption. So it's in this way, by questioning the basis and the outcome, Brookfield claims that actions can actually have the results that we want them to have. So to take this sort of broad idea of critical thinking into my discipline of law, what does this mean? Well, it means that we should be teaching students to critique what they are learning in 3 different ways. The first is what I refer to as an internal critique. We want to push our students to ask, is it actually correct that there is some underlying right answer in the law, just waiting to be uncovered through the skillful application of legal reasoning by judges? Or is judicial decision making, in fact, more likely to be motivated by questions of morality, politics, and personal choice? To engage in such a critique, of course, students must first spend time becoming masters of the law and becoming masters of the orthodox and traditional legal decision making. But then they must question the assumptions that exist in that legal decision making. If indeed it is the case that judicial decision making is influenced by these other factors, this critique should then lead students to explore other questions, questioning other assumptions, to get them to ask very serious questions about, well, what then is the role of judges vis-a-vis the other branches of government? What should be the process of judicial appointments? How do we protect judicial independence, and what does that mean if these other factors are at play? And is there a desirability then to see a more diverse judiciary, a more diverse bench making these decisions? So the second type of critical thinking that the law requires, again still in my discipline, is an external critique. And this looks at law as a social, cultural, historical, political, complex phenomenon. Students must be exposed to other perspectives on the place that law plays in society. We need to teach students feminist critiques of the law. We need to teach students the idea of legal realism and critical legal studies and the views that they bring to the role of law in society. Critical race studies, postmodern theories of law. The exposure of students to these different perspectives over the course of their legal education, in my view, achieves 2 things. And I must just sort of interject at this point and say I was truly delighted yesterday to be visiting JGU Law School at the invitation of one of Raj's faculty members, Juma Sen, and we were talking about the Feminist Judgments Project, something that I've been involved in at the Australian level, and Juma is now leading an Indian Feminist Judgments Project, where academics, practitioners and others are asked to rewrite leading cases that have occurred in India and the Indian Supreme and High Courts through the lens of a feminist perspective. Would this change the outcome? Would this change the voices that are heard? Would this change the way the stories are told? And so that was just a wonderful collaboration that we were able to have yesterday. So why expose students to these perspectives? The first is simply to give them the knowledge that the different perspectives from which established institutions and norms must be understood exist. That's the knowledge dimension. But the second is then to give them the skills to understand how these perspectives can be used to understand the impact of and the critique of these institutions and norms. But more importantly, and this is what the Feminist Judgments Project does, to reimagine these norms and institutions through these perspectives. So in this way, students must be encouraged to think of the law's role and impact in society. To what extent is the law and its institutions facilitating the achievement of democracy and human rights, two matters that Raj was already talking about? To what extent is law facilitating and being a mechanism for justice? Or to what extent is itself a means of oppression, protecting vested interests and entrenching things like class privilege? So students need to be taught these alternative perspectives so they can analyse and critique these existing legal rules and structures and then take them to engage actively engage in law reform. In addition, increasingly they must also have a global perspective on the law and be aware of key ethical questions that arise in their own society and that are arising in other societies. This, in my view, is even more important in a world like we live in today, in which social media is now a key source for news for many of our students, including political news. This means that our students are no longer exposed to a variety of political views when they read the news. Rather, the selective nature of social media, relationships in posts, and the various algorithms that determine which news items are flashed before users mean that our students will be primarily exposed, in this form at least, to news and perspectives that reinforce their biases about an interpretation of political events. So the third way that critical thinking relates to a legal education is a little bit different. So rather than focusing on as a form of critical thought, this third way is focused on the importance of teaching students that learning is a lifelong endeavour. The law as they learn it in 2018 at UNSW Law or at Tyndale Global Law School will be very different when they are asked to apply it in 10 years' time. Certainly the constitutional law that I learned when I was a law student increasing long time ago is very different from the law that I currently teach. It's very different from the law that I need to apply when I'm asked to engage in particular matters. So our students need to be well equipped to expect change and growth in knowledge and to understand that, and then be able to direct their learning. So we need to make sure they have a capacity from their university education to gain access to fresh material and understand fresh material, but then bring, of course, that critical thought and be able to interrogate that fresh material. There are no doubt challenges that are presented to my vision of the university and the law school as a vehicle for socially minded and critically thinking graduates. Speaking from the Australian experience, there are challenges as universities have grown in size, meaning student cohorts and class sizes have often dramatically increased, well into their hundreds. There are also challenges because, as Raj has already spoken about, the costs of university education, creating barriers in terms of access to education. This is not just in my experience in relation to fees and the debt that may be incurred because of the fees, but in the necessity that we expect students to then forego an earning capacity, at least in part, during the time that they are students. And for many people, this is just not a possibility given the other responsibilities that they have. What this means is that low socioeconomic groups and minorities within communities are often not receiving the benefits of university education. This has a number of dimensions to it. Raj has already referred to the fact that these individuals may not receive the socioeconomic mobility benefit of a university education. It means that these individuals' voices and perspectives are not heard in the classroom during critical discussions so that others can be exposed to those perspectives. It means that these individuals are not exposed to the knowledge and then the critical engagement that a university degree will hopefully provide. Further, they're not given the ready access into the network of educated and mobile peers that a university education provides. There are other challenges as education in my country is viewed more as a commodity. And this leads to expectations that students will pass a course provided they have paid their fees. In law specifically, we've also seen pressures that have been placed upon us from the legal profession they are now wanting their graduates to be job ready once they graduate, so they can start charging their graduates out at the rate of a solicitor. This has meant that they've pushed more and more skills-based education onto law schools, which of course must come at the cost of time and space to develop analytical and critical mindset. There are also pressures to move much learning and assessment online. And this can present serious pedagogical challenges, particularly for what I was referring to before, the deeper and critical learnings. So how then has the Faculty of Law at UNSW responded to the possibilities of a university education and also to some of these challenges that I've now outlined? I'm just going to outline just a few key parts of our degree and our programs that I think demonstrate that we have maintained a commitment to graduating critical members of civil society in the face of some of these pressures. But I'm not saying that we have all of the solutions, and I look forward to the discussion to follow. The first is that despite all of the pressures that I've outlined in terms of the neoliberal pressures, at UNSW Law we have not, and we have a commitment not to, compromise small group face-to-face teaching models. Now that sounds like a simple solution, but certainly I've taught at other law schools where there's very much a push into larger courses, larger classes, and also into the online mode of teaching. At UNSW Law, for every compulsory law course, we teach our students in small groups of between 25 and 35 students for 2 hours twice a week. It's a seminar-style small group teaching designed so that students complete their readings before class and they gain their knowledge, and then they're pushed to apply, analyse, question and critique those readings in the seminar. Now we've been doing that since we were established. We've been flipping our classroom, to use the modern terminology, before the phrase was even invented. This is no doubt a more costly model of education delivery, and there are pressures, and we are not immune from those pressures, although, as I said, it is an ongoing commitment within our law school. The second way is that we expose students to the social and ethical consequences of the law, and also the possibilities of the law for those suffering economic, social and other disadvantage. So the UNSW Law Faculty incorporates an operating community legal centre, the Kingsford Legal Centre, and it's the oldest legal clinic in Australia, and we're very proud of its association with the UNSW Law Faculty. The clinic both teaches law students but also provides legal services to disadvantaged clients and communities. Up to 1,600 disadvantaged clients access the clinic every year. Students work with disadvantaged clients and communities to learn the law which affects these clients, while analysing access to justice challenges and coming up with ways to address those challenges. All students taking the compulsory law course, Law, Ethics and Justice, and that's 500 students every year, engage with the clinic. They must interview clients and work with the solicitor to find solutions to their problems. And finally, at UNSW Law, we are embracing the possibilities of technology within the legal profession. Particularly, we're looking at how technology might contribute to better social justice outcomes. So again, we have this focus on law and justice when we come to technology. We've just launched a new hub called the Allens Hub for Law, Innovation and Technology that's led by a colleague of mine, Professor Lyria Bennett-Moses. And through that hub, we now offer an elective course called Designing Technology Solutions for Access to Justice. This course aims to teach law students how to build legal expert systems through building an app, and how to think critically about the role of such systems in the broader access to justice space. So students have to build an app in partnership with a not-for-profit organisation. So they have to identify a real pressing social justice issue, and with that NGO, they develop this web-based application to try to address that issue. So just as one example, in partnership with the Diplomacy Training Program, a group of UNSW law students has built an app that identified relevant human rights instruments applicable to migrant workers in the Australian region based on country of origin and country of employment, so they're able to see which instruments would apply to them. So throughout this particular course, students are encouraged to think creatively about the possibility, but also critically about the limitations of technology solutions to broader social justice challenges. So the second contribution that universities make to a just society is to turn then to the other key contribution of universities, which is research, and research that is directed at just solutions to real-world problems. So I do think that the research that academics conduct can directly contribute to this goal of a just society. In Australia at least, this contribution is no longer simply reliant upon an individual researcher taking the initiative, wearing the time and the work commitment of translating their work into the resolution of real-world social justice problems. So in Australia, we have an Australian Research Council quality assessment exercise that has traditionally just looked at the quality of research, looking at quality and excellence of research and outputs and publications. In 2018, that exercise included a second strand, which was a strand looking at the engagement and impact of our researchers' research, our academics' research. Now, at the law faculty at UNSW Law, we take this responsibility for engagement and reach for impact very seriously, and we do it in a particular way. We seek to engage with government, the profession, industry, NGOs, and the wider community in ways that are focused on seeking just solutions to real-world problems. Now, it would take far too long for me to list all of those different contributions that our academics are making, and so I just want to finish with three. The first is the work of Professor Ross Buckley. His work is developing a regulatory toolkit to assist regulators of financial markets. Now, you might say to me, this doesn't sound like an issue to a pressing social justice problem. But this toolkit is to allow regulators to assess, adapt and advance digital financial services. Okay? Millions of people across the world are currently excluded from the financial system because they are not able to access banks and therefore they're not able to have bank accounts. But through mobile and digital platforms, that can be changed. And the work that Ross has been doing, particularly across the Pacific and with governments across the Pacific, have allowed regulators to regulate financial systems in a way that millions of people are gaining access to financial services. The second, and I think it's a particularly apt one to talk about today, as today is the International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples, is the work of my colleague, Professor Megan Davis. Megan Davis is a Cobble woman from Queensland, one of our Aboriginal professors at the UNSW Law faculty. Megan has served on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues and then subsequently has sat on the Prime Minister's expert panel on constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in 2012. More recently, in 2016 and 2017, Megan has led a series of consultations for the first time, that's right, in 2016 and 2017, for the first time, a series of consultation with Aboriginal people themselves about what they might want from constitutional recognition of their status as First Nations. This process that Megan led culminated in 2017 in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a document that was issued by more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders from Uluru itself, seeking a particular form of constitutional recognition. So through the process that Megan led, the voices of these people were finally heard on an issue that had previously been decided without them. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, I'm very pleased to say, is now driving political debates about this issue, and I think will be a key part of future reform towards, particularly around political representation in the Australian constitutional system for our First Nations. The third and final sort of matter that I'd like to speak about is the work of Professor Jane McAdam. Now, Jane's work conceptualises the phenomenon of climate change-related displacement. So she's a refugee and migrant law professor. Her legal analysis, and that's combined with in-depth fieldwork across Kiribati, Tuvalu, Fiji, Bangladesh, and here in India, has showed that the impact of climate change does not itself cause displacement of communities. Rather, it's the impact of climate change that overlays existing vulnerabilities, including poverty, environmental degradation, resource scarcity, and lack of livelihood. And it's this combination that's creating massive displacement issues. So her work has exposed gaps in international law to address this dilemma, as well as constructive new opportunities. She's been commissioned now by the UNHCR to develop its institutional strategy on climate change and disaster displacement over the short, medium, and long term. So her work is now going to form the basis for UNHCR's ongoing strategic engagement in this area and will have a direct impact on how the UN and governments across the world responds to the needs of people displaced by the impacts of disaster and climate change. Now, of course, research into these pressing social problems by our academics contributes itself to the resolution of these many, many challenges across the world. But there is a connection between what I said, the first contribution of education is to a just society, and this second contribution. At UNSW Law, we're very committed to ensuring that these world-leading professors that I've just described are also in our classrooms. We are committed to having our world-leading academics in our classrooms teaching our students. To take just one example, Professor Megan Davis, despite her research, despite her international commitments, despite her national commitments, has always made time to teach throughout her career. And she currently teaches 2 courses. She teaches a compulsory course and also an Aboriginal Peoples in the Law course. Her work and explanation of the work that she is doing on the ground inspires and engages our students. I was very pleased at the Uluru Convention that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. 3 of the people there were her former students. We had one delegate, a Wiradjuri woman who was a UNSW law graduate, actually in the convention itself. We had a constitutional lawyer who was a UNSW law graduate, assisting in the drafting and the constitutional questions around the Uluru Statement, and we had another graduate acting as a technical assistant. So UNSW Law, needless to say, could really not be prouder of the type of citizens that our students are graduating to become. So to conclude very briefly, universities and institutions of higher education have 2 key contributions, I think, to creating a more just society. And firstly, this is directly through education, and they contribute to a just society when they encourage students to be critically thinking and change-orientated citizens. And secondly then, through the work of their academics, they can contribute directly to the resolution of acute social justice issues within societies, and also involve students with that research and motivate and engage them. This connection is not easy, it's not always inevitable, but it's vital. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor. So we've had 2 incredibly engaging, stimulating thoughts from both of our discussants today. Different perspectives, but I think there's a bit of common themes between the 2. Some commentary around some of the opportunities and challenges for the role of education in creating a just society. So with our discussant's indulgence, perhaps if we open up, and our host indulgent I should say too, open up to a broader discussion. If anyone wanted to offer a reflection, if you had some questions, wanted to make a contribution based on what you've heard or your own experience, please do. Maybe if I can ask anyone that does though, if you could just start by introducing yourself more broadly to the group.
I think I agree with the points that you...
Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Appleby. I teach at the National Institute of Education, Planning and Administration here at New Delhi. And I'm very much engaged with this whole idea of government withdrawing from funding of higher education. So with that, the loan burden is really, as you said, that it's really, impacting the quality of higher education in US and also across. We are also coming in this regime of HIFA and the new act that we have. So with that, I think that is, creating another platform for injustice, because the haves and haves not have already been divided, and this additional resource which is depleting in higher education will actually create more inequality and injustice in the society. So, I think Australia has addressed this to some extent, or are you still struggling with this issue? And in India, what is your take on that, and how do you see a future with higher education engagement in that field?
Thank you very much, Annie, for the question. I think the withdrawal of funding or the decrease of government funding of higher education is certainly not something that we have resolved or addressed, at least in my view, adequately in Australia. It remains an issue whereby universities are increasingly reliant upon student fees and increasingly reliant upon international student fees to make sure that they are able to continue to operate at a level that they would wish. And so this withdrawal of funding is leading to that commodification pressure that I was talking about. That then leads to pressures on individual academics as to how many students they should be teaching, how they should be teaching, moving towards the online platforms, etc. It's also something we see in Australia in relation to research funding. So my second sort of pillar, even in the course of my relatively short period as an academic, over the course of 10 years, we've seen the success rates in Australian Research Council funding plummet, particularly in relation to the law and social sciences areas. Just recently, the success rates in relation to fellowships was 18%, but in law there was no mid-career fellowships awarded at all. That's the first time, as I understand, that's happened. And so what this means is that our researchers don't have the time and funding available for them to do these projects that I have just related to you. Ross Buckley was only able to do his work because of Australian Research Council funding together with funding from the UN and from other governments across the world. Similarly, Jane has been very successful in fellowships and discovery application grants, which has allowed her to achieve the research. For the next wave of researchers, this funding is drying up, which means where are they going to find it? We're increasingly looking at other philanthropic areas, what we refer to linkage programs, which is sort of industry or government joint research, but these aren't without their own challenges. Philanthropic funding rarely comes without strings attached. When you're working in my area, for example, I particularly look at the role of judges. If you're working on funding on research that's been funded by a judicial college, there's a particular restriction that attaches to that, and you don't have the freedom that you would otherwise have. So I certainly don't think that we have resolved the challenge of higher education funding. It is one that remains.
Yeah, well, I've published a lot. I'll be happy to share that with you. I'll keep it short in relation to funding is obviously a big challenge, and I for one believe that the state in India has abdicated its responsibility for a long time. Part of the problem is that, and that's a threshold problem, which is that we have not been, and I would blame, to some extent we have to share the responsibility that we have not been able to effectively articulate the relationship between higher education and, let's say, even economic development. And so there is, and one of the things which China has done more effectively, because China, obviously the great universities in China are all public universities, and when we in India lament about the fact that not a single Indian university is one of the top 200, the Chinese have had now 7 universities in the top 200, and all of that has happened in the last 3 decades. So, and they're all public universities in that sense. So there is something to be said about the fact that we need to significantly enhance the quality and excellence of even the best of our institutions in India, but I do believe that excellence comes with cost. And the question then is, who takes care of that? If we were to build an egalitarian society with access to education for people who may not be able to afford, then clearly we need to address the question of funding and resources more effectively, and that burden should not be shifted to the people who are attempting to seek entry into that. I, for one, believe that the state should understand more, I would say, in a more deeper manner, the benefits of higher education, but I also think we need to significantly expand the possibility of both corporate philanthropy as well as corporate social responsibility in funding relating to higher education. It's these two sectors are, we've not at all had significant impact in higher education. There is not any much of incentives attached to it. Many years ago in India, the then Planning Commission constituted a committee called the Narayana Murthy Committee. The Narayana Murthy is chief mentor and then chief mentor, but now back in one of India's largest technology companies called the Infosys. And that committee, which had both, it was one of the best institutional initiatives we have had in India, where it had both the public sector and private sector participation. And they recommended a number of things, including significant tax exemptions for people who are ready to fund higher education, long provision of land and buildings. So many things were, none of them, of course, were implemented. Now, of course, Planning Commission doesn't exist in that form. But the point I'm trying to say is, we need resources, and those resources have to come from, to some extent, public sector, but to a large extent, private sector. But then that private sector need to be not-for-profit, philanthropic, as well as more on the CSR side, and we have not been creative about it.
And most of my work has been around the education of the most marginal communities in India, and I'm also interested in poverty, what's happening in the changing urban and private schooling for the poor, which is a business today. So I've been doing some work on this. But in regard to the topic of today, I do believe that education and social justice, there is obviously a connection. One has to look at social justice in and through education, keeping in mind whatever are the larger constraints. There are two or three things I'd like to say. One is that this is not a new question, and I think India is very important in understanding how these questions and how it was envisioned far earlier. And I would take you back to the 1850s, to the 1950s, when we had, especially among Dalit communities, an intense aspiration to education and extraordinary leadership, which looked at each of these questions, whether it was democracy, citizenship, right to education, what the institutions should do, and what kind of imagination. And I would take you back to Jyotiba Phule, Ambedkar, who is today talked about, but not in this connection in terms of social justice and education, because it's very clearly. So I would say that one, we need to go back as we grapple with these issues today. Let us go back to history and look at what was the imagination and how did these communities and their leaderships actually push for public education and what it should do. And there are many questions, so that's something which I'm currently doing. I think that's important. The second thing I think is that we must also look at some of the examples and some of the experiments. I would go back to my own university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a lot of the things that you are saying, and Amit and George and I are classmates actually of the 1970s, when this new university emerged, and where there was, what was envisioned was many of the qualities that you are talking about of democracy, of tolerance, etc. And what is interesting is that institutional structures were imagined which would address excess, social justice, and excellence, because we are seen as the most excellent, but we are also a university, because of university policy, brought in a huge number of communities which were disadvantaged, first generation, cultural diversity, and all of them have done very well in different parts. So it is not difficult to bring together excellence and equality, and we have a university. Now, within the university, as you said, curriculum, pedagogy, all of what you said the dialogical, the way in which, and one reason for that when you have little seminars, when you have pedagogy, is that in such a stratified and unequal society, when you come into the university and have this pedagogy and the curriculum, you rethink your prejudices and you are able to understand what is caste, etc., etc. So I would say that our social sciences, and in the School of Social Sciences, has been very important, and these are the subjects which are today going with the market. So without a good social science component in your university, you are unlikely to get critical students. And we also have these, we set up a center for the study of discrimination and exclusion. And we have a women's studies center, but both these are, centers which are not getting adequate funding. So they are centers that are likely to close down. So I do agree with you that the possibilities of that critical pedagogy, engagement, you need time, you need funding, and you need the public university. And I would also say that in India today, we need to see that what kind of private, and most of the private is for profit, what kind of public do we have? And I think that is the kind, and here I would agree with you, that it is a lot, research and academic research can do a lot, and you have, I have sort of consulted a lot of the work from Australia, Professor Cornell, for instance, and there are many who work on privatization and education, the poor and social justice. So I think there is a lot of learning both ways, how you have addressed it, and I think we have a lot of lessons. But one of the problems, if you are a university which is critical and which is, asking questions, is that you get a backlash, which is what we are facing now. So I think these are questions that
I'm George Matthew, Chairman of Institute of Social Sciences in New Delhi. We were all classmates. Yes. Thank you for the thought-provoking presentations. Just 2-3 ideas. One is, after observing what is happening at the higher education level, are we not creating an elite class in India? I'm talking about India. And then what happens is an elite capture of the system. And how far their knowledge and system they are using for themselves, and how far it is going to the grassroots level, to the lowest level. Second point is that we have educational institutions, all this, but what is really happening at the lower level? For the last several years I am working with the local government system. Millions of men and women are getting elected into the local government system in India, villages and all. And when we analyze and study and do research, how many of them are educated? How many of them know reading and writing? Hardly any. But there is a way of teaching them and giving information to them. But the government is not investing in these issues. For the last 30 years, we are fighting for that. There is one institution in Hyderabad, NIRD, National Institute of Rural Development, and then every state has 1 or 2 centers. I have visited most of these centers. Can we say in Hindi? Namke Vasta. What is that called?
for name.
For
name.
For name's sake.
Sorry, in name. They are only names in name.
What name? And what quality education? How much is happening? It can be expected. All I wanted to say is that what the present situation, we must focus on how non-formal education, centers of learning, non-governmental organizations, think tanks can be encouraged so that the education goes well. Education is investing in people. Raj Kumar is coming from Kanyakumari. I am coming very close to him. 200 years ago, a lady ruler in our state declared that every child must go to school 200 years ago. And the expense for sending the children to school will be reimbursed by the state. That was a declaration 200 years ago. And today you come to that state. Of course, you have gone a little to the other side, but we are all together. 100% literacy. Men, women are more educated than men in our state. And what quality change has happened? I mean, it's a case study. So, this elite capture has to stop, and we have to face the realities at the grassroots level. Thank you.
I have a question in opposition of vital pillars of democracy, and they play a very important role in solid and sound democracy. But in today's time, when disagreement is not being taken very nicely by people, so how do you think that what role an institution like yours can play in increasing the government for open discussion and more tolerance, wider acceptability? So what role can higher education institutions like yours can play?
So the thing is, right now, look at the situation and say maybe there is a certain type of institutional intervention that might happen at some levels, which may be targeting or few institutions, or even not necessarily targeting few institutions, but the discourse is numbing the kind of intellectual diversity that ought to prevail in academic institutions. But to me, there is a fundamental problem that we have, and that is also, I would strongly mention here that both the ideological left and the ideological right has contributed to that situation. We have systematically undermined the possibility of institutions to become independent, and our dependence on government and government money, government regulation, government control, government deciding almost everything that institutions ought to be doing has inevitably brought us to a stage today where governments not being happy about an institution is actually directly impinging on what happens in the institution. I, for one, would like to begin this discourse by saying that, how did we reach this stage? And to ask a more serious question, that how do we come out of the situation? We need to make our universities become more autonomous, more independent, and more, in some ways, or rather less dependent upon government. And for that, universities ought to take responsibility. Some things we can talk, there is the numbing of discourse has happened on multiple levels of political diversity. So this numbing of discourse that has happened is not only confined to the right, but is also in the left. And so we have to have a more, I would say, honest conversation about it. And unfortunately, honest conversations don't happen on many issues, and definitely not in this issue. So it's a longer response I would like to give, but I just want to say that the way to deal with this is to more and more make institutions autonomous, independent, and institutions also should recognize the larger responsibility that they need to have. And I think one of the important realizations that universities also should have is, and I tell this to my faculty and students, and to ask a question: is there anything different between a university and an NGO? Is there anything different between a university and a think tank? Is there anything different between a university and a social advocacy group? Is there anything different between a university and a corporation? I believe universities are not any of these things. A university is not an NGO. A university is not a social advocacy group. A university is not a lobbying group. A university is not a corporation. A university is not a government agency. If a university is not any one of these things, then it ought to recognize its responsibility that it is playing a very unique role in the society. And hence, what it does and what it creates and how it impacts need to be constantly calibrated and all the time trying to achieve a sense of balance and to contribute to an informed knowledge and understanding and to help achieve nuanced understanding of issues. We have lost it. We don't have capacities today to discuss issues in a nuanced manner. Almost every issue that we take, you pick up sexual harassment, you pick up drug abuse in campuses, you pick up ideological disagreement, conflict resolution, you pick up any issues, the division that happens in society, we see in the media, we see in civil society. But I would like to hope that we can create universities as spaces where we can have a more nuanced discussion and understanding of these issues.
Sorry, one minute. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question. So I'm Peter, I'm from, and I have a question, Raj, for you mostly, but also Gabrielle, you can probably chime in and give us an Australian background. But a common thing that I found, and the VP Naidu touched on it in his really thought-provoking speech at the convocation, which Raj invited me to, and I was very, very fortunate to go. He touched on the brain drain that's occurring in India and across the world, and it states in your name, JGU, Global University. How do you prevent the next generation of kids going overseas and then not coming back? I think the three key words from Naidu were learn, earn, and return, and he really stressed the return. So how do you prevent the next generation from implementing a just society overseas rather than here in India where it's most important?
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. It's an interdependent world. If people are concerned about people moving from India to other parts, my uncles and aunts in Kanyakumari feel that I have gone so far away from there. So the movement of people across geographical places and societies has been the trend, and the world has witnessed that for a long time. I think so in some ways, for me personally, that's not a major problem. Although the question that really we need to ask is that what kind of, at least higher education, we ask the question, what kind of institutional ecosystem that we need to create in India so that the best and the brightest of young people think about being in India and contributing to it. This is not to say that there's something fundamentally good about being in India as opposed to being elsewhere, but to recognize that how do we augment the intellectual capacities of very bright people. And in some ways, for us, I am very conscious of this idea of being in India or being elsewhere, because 20% of our full-time faculty members are non-Indian nationals recruited from 26 countries in the world. They are not in Iceland or Bulgaria or United States or Australia or Sean, my colleague, he's an Australian now in India for the last decade or so. So the idea of being in the place where you're from needs to be slightly calibrated, but the larger point one could make, which is Chinese have made this, is that there's something to be said about the fact that we need bright people, at least in all walks of life, but definitely in India. I am quite, it makes me sad to report to you that in the last 10 years, I have given over 4,000 talks across colleges and schools in India, from Kanyakumari to Nagaland. And at the end of these talks, I ask a question to young people, particularly high school students, and to some extent colleges, but mostly in high schools. I ask them how many of them would like to become an academic, and the answer is less than 1%. Most of them is no. If at all I push them hard, then I might get 1 or 2 hands. So there is a need for bright young people to be attracted to academia, and also there is an increasingly, when people get opportunities to study abroad, there is also a rather reluctance to come back to India. And part of the problem is that we need to build an ecosystem that makes India and Indian higher education institutions an attractive place for them to build their lives and careers and their research and their teaching and all of that. It doesn't help for us to say that, you know what, it will be, I mean, I say this by the way, I tell when we recruit faculty that India is not for the weak-hearted. Are you ready for it? But that's because we want to be very transparent about the fact that for an overseas faculty member to move to India is not like moving from United States to Singapore or Hong Kong or South Korea, Taipei or even Shanghai. Moving to Sonipat is a different calling in life. Are you ready for it? But having said that, it's a challenge that we need to address, and we need to create a better ecosystem in our country that will address the fundamental reasons why people are, let's say, not wanting to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question, and I'll address it in a slightly different way, because I think Raj has addressed the question in relation to India, because we're actually finding in UNSW a situation in relation to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. A similar concern or challenge has been raised. So the UNSW Law Faculty is very proud of the fact that it has now graduated more than 100 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, which is leading in Australia. And we're very proud of all of those students. And of course, with education comes the possibility of social mobility, and a lot of those students are choosing to then go and work in corporate law firms. And of course, we must respect their choice, their autonomy, their self-determination at that moment. But the concern has been raised because what we're seeing is that corporate law firms are targeting our Indigenous students from their very first week at UNSW Law to come into programs, Indigenous programs within the corporate setting. And those students are not being given an opportunity to consider other potentials with what to do with their law degree. This is a particular concern because, particularly in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia, there is a real need for educated community members to return to those communities and help them address their own problems. So what we've recently done is, under our Vice-Chancellor, we've now established a Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous. The inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous is Professor Megan Davies from the law school, and she's now in the throes of finalising a strategy, not to stop these students from necessarily going into a corporate scene, but to provide them, again, from the moment they come into our university, with knowledge of the other opportunities, and make sure those other opportunities are in their minds as they're making that choice. Because I think, as Raj has correctly said, there is it's a nuanced challenge, because there's the element of individual choice and there's the element of what education provides for these students, but then we can make sure that the choice is properly informed and at the end.
With everyone's permission, I thought what we could do is perhaps continue the discussion over some nibbles and a bit of networking. This has been a extraordinary, stimulating session. It's the kind of topic that very difficult to resolve and come to consensual unanimity on what exactly is the relationship between education and justice, or a just society. I've always been confused with regard to what the purpose of education is. And I think Raj raised it, and so did Gabrielle. Very often, many who are involved in the education space, either as faculty members or administrators, see education as being linked directly with employability and nothing beyond that. Just society is a completely different ballgame. And it begs also the question as to whether education itself creates just societies. Our societies, for example, the nature that George and Geeta drew attention to in marginalized communities where education is not available, are those societies necessarily unjust societies? And I think this debate is going to be a complex one. It's going to be a continuous one. But for those of us who are involved in the education space, I think one of the purposes that we see is really how we might be able to collaborate in order to transform lives, possibly make it a little better. And there I stress the word collaboration, because I think there is much to be gained by an exchange of ideas, which is how this knowledge exchange discussion forum was created. And thanks to all of you for having participated. I couldn't have asked for a more distinguished audience, or indeed more distinguished speakers and a more distinguished moderator. But having said that, may I gift you this multi-purpose pen, which you cannot carry with you as hand baggage, because it has many things that security and stuff.